Welcome to episode 3 of the Contrapublic broadcast. In episode 2, we talked about intersecular parallels and cross-secular contrasts. And today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about fractal foreshadowing, what that means for our current moment, and even for events as specific as the situation between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and NATO, land civilization and sea civilization, land powers and sea powers, and how they interact and how they've interacted in recent history. So the example that I'm going to use for fractal foreshadowing is something that I spoke about briefly at the end of the last broadcast. I was referencing the summer of spring, which is the consciousness revolution after the American high. And I was talking about how I think that the borders of the consciousness revolution should be defined by the consciousness revolution, not necessarily by a certain person being assassinated or voted into office. Initially, in the early 1960s, the drug culture was not illegal. It wasn't illegal to take LSD. It wasn't illegal to take any number of drugs, to be experimenting with psilocybin. Everything was kind of free reign. The US government had not decided that these drugs were contrary or acting contrary to their goals for society. People had free reign to explore and experiment and embrace the new experiences that they were having because of taking these drugs. And so the borders, it seems to me, of the consciousness revolution make most sense if you do about 1960 to 1980. And the reason you would cut it off at 1980 or 1981 is because of the declared war on drugs by Ronald Reagan. So that is the summer generation, summer-wide moment of summer that we're dealing with here in the fractal foreshadowing idea. Now, what I noticed with the fractal foreshadowing is that it seems that now that we are moving into this next saeculum, that we've been getting a lot of the same kinds of events and even a lot of the same kinds of characters back on the world stage and back on the domestic stage. For example, as far as drugs are concerned, there have been a number of laws that were enacted beginning in about 2015, though there may have been a few earlier ones here or there, but they were in the 2000s, where drug use or recreational drug use, marijuana use, has been made legal, or punishments have been loosened for possession or use of things like marijuana and even other drugs. This started, and of course, I'm not even sure if I would call marijuana a drug, but we'll just use that term for the sake of dealing with this map and for the fractal pattern, which is really what we're trying to explore here. So these loosenings of the laws in relation to what was generation defining in the consciousness revolution between 1960 and 1980, these reflect the beginning of the consciousness revolution. So the situation concerning consciousness and consciousness altering substances that was there in 1960, that situation or milieu, that set of circumstances, that collection, complication of circumstances that existed in that moment is now coming into being again. And what was necessary in order for that set of circumstances to come into being again was a loosening of the laws and a reversal of the laws that shut the consciousness revolution down as a moment, that cut it off. So what we've seen is the laws are changing. You've also gotten a number of books that are very similar to books about drugs, ayahuasca, psilocybin, mushroom explorations, the Eleusinian mysteries, the origins of the Christian faith, as perhaps being induced by drug experiences, hallucinogenic experiences. A lot of this literature, this kind of literature, was very prevalent in the very early 1960s and throughout that whole generation. But it was coming into the fore in the early 1960s, and it played a huge role in defining the generation. And so what we've been seeing is that same kind of information, that same kind of legal climate being something that is returning to the moment that we're in now. Now, it even gets specific with things like Timothy Leary being the head of this experimental psychological hallucinogenic program that was at Harvard in the early 1960s. And so he's there, he's experimenting, he has his role, he's working with inmates in one or two jails, I think it was, in Massachusetts near Boston. And that program ends up getting shut down. Now, an interesting thing is that same program, very recently, I think in 2020, got resurrected. And I believe Jordan Peterson now has the position that Timothy Leary had. And both of them occupy a very similar position in that they're spokesmen for awakenings. And this makes a lot of sense if you see Timothy Leary as a spokesman for the consciousness awakening and a revolution of 1960 to 1980. And if you also see Jordan Peterson as a similar kind of character for 2020 to possibly 2100. However, I think that it's more of a 20-year period that belongs to this 1960 to maybe 1965 situation. And I have suspicions for a further fractal breakdown of the consciousness revolution period. And I'll talk about those later. But what I see and what I encourage you guys to check into is how any kind of events that happened between 1960 and 1980 are thematically representative and a model of the events that are going to happen right now from 2020. And maybe you even have a couple years beforehand. Maybe it's like 2016. But firmly 2020 to 2100, this whole summer saeculum, I see this. So where do we have here to here and then here to here? This thing, and let me see actually if I can draw here. So this place here is a model thematically, event-wise, character-wise, for everything that's going to go on here. And I also think, and this is something that will need to be explored, that you can probably cut this down into quarters, and each one of these quarters will correspond to a large quarter here. So you'll have this being like 1960 to 1965, 65 to 70. And then you would have this being 70 to 75, and then 75 to 80. And one of the reasons why I think this, I mean, there are endless reasons. Everything that I'm seeing in the media and in the art and in the philosophy, psychology, science, technology, everything that I'm seeing around me leads me to believe that this period here is a model for exactly what has been beginning here and what's going to keep going until this point here. And so I think one interesting thing that occurred to me just the other day, I mean, I'd been thinking about it for a little while, but it really kind of came into relief, was that probably 1968 to 75, my Vietnam people can, oh, sorry, this is not here. My Vietnam people can clarify this for me. But this seems to me like the height of American involvement in Vietnam. And so this would be the third quarter area of the 20-year period, right? And so what's interesting is we have the French and Indian Wars here, okay? Now, if you don't know, or if you don't remember, France colonized Vietnam. So, in a sense, it's a war with the French. I would also be interested to see what happened as far as the laws establishing Indian reservations in this period right here. That would be very interesting. Maybe somebody can look that up. I didn't get a chance to look that up before I started recording, but I think it could be another link showing that this generation here is a fractal model for the large saeculum here. And I think that it would probably work, as all fractals do, for each of the preceding seasons or generations. So each of the generations, that precede a large saeculum that has their same season or same seasonal character. So you would have, okay, summer of spring is going to be a model for the summer saeculum. Then you would have, autumn of summer as a model for the autumn saeculum. And then after that, you would have winter as a thematic model for the winter saeculum. And then you would have spring as a thematic model for the spring saeculum. This is my suspicion. With many, many things, I've seen that if it works in one area, you can reasonably expect that it's going to work as a rule for all other areas. And the best way to do this is definitely with the cross-saecular contrasts here and here, and then with the intersaecular, we have these, the intersaecular, and then they're all headed in the same direction, parallels. So these things make it so that you can predict backwards. And this is something that I've been discussing with some of my friends is, okay, they want to say, and it's fine, and I want to discuss this, right? You can't predict the future. And what I say is, I mean, I don't think that I can predict the future. However, when I look on this map, there's something that is the case for me, which is I'm ignorant of the past. So I don't know what happened in the past in the same way that I don't know what will happen in the future. So epistemically, I don't know in both directions. But the interesting thing is that if I use a pattern based off of some information that I do know with about the information that's in this arrangement of history, I can predict what kind of information I'm going to find in the past. And this is what I was talking about in episode 1 when I briefly mentioned a Western civilization having a conflict with an Eastern civilization or an Eastern sea power. And what I found is, okay, I said, we have Pearl Harbor over here, right? World War II, Pearl Harbor. That's Western civilization, and it has a naval conflict in Hawaii with a Pacific, well, let's call it a Pacific civilization or a Pacific people or a Pacific power. We have to be broad here, but even in being broad, this doesn't make us wrong or our findings unfounded, because we're dealing with a narrative wheel that is representing a narrative world. All the information around us, it turns out, is narrative. And so when you organize it like this, very interesting things happen and will come out of the map, will jump out at you. And so this is one of the things that jumped out to me is, okay, I had this question. And I do this all the time with all kinds of topics. So, question. We know there was a conflict between America and Japan at Pearl Harbor in, 1942. Now, if we jump across the meta-saeculum, will we find another instance of Pacific people killing people or perhaps someone from a Western, a representative, a narrative representative or a symbol of Western civilization? And so what I did is I came up with the question because I saw an event over here. And I know that cross-saecular contrasts are very dependable. And I know also that they don't just work they don't work over here and then say over here. Like, the information is not going to be waiting there for you. You're not going to find it because it doesn't exist. And that's just not how time works from what we see with this map. Or it's not how history works. Whatever the organizing principles are for history, this place over here is not going to give you a complementary contrast over here. However, if you jump across 180 degrees from this point to over here, you find that in 1776, Captain Cook was in the Hawaiian Islands, and in 1779, on February 14th, he was murdered. And so that is a very interesting contrast, cross-saecular contrast. And it makes me think a couple of things. It makes me think, maybe is the summer saeculum a saeculum of great men, of great characters, in a way where, or is it the crisis at the end of a summer saeculum? Is it a crisis of great men? Whereas perhaps the crisis at the end of the winter saeculum is a crisis of great collections of men. I mean, I know we had great men in World War II. However, I'm just trying to come up with questions that maybe can lead me to finding patterns for what I can expect in different parts of the meta-saeculum. And I've seen some very interesting things, which I don't want to get into a rabbit trail. I mean, everything on here is frightfully interesting to me. But if I were to just jump into every single thing that I've found, I'd be on rabbit trails for hours and hours, perhaps even days. Really, I can talk about this for a long time. Okay, so we know that we can find these patterns here. And so for the fractal foreshadowing, what we see is that, so to return to this, is that 1960 to 1980 seems to be the model for what is starting to happen since 2020 and what will probably keep happening until we get to 2100. This is my sneaking suspicion, okay? So, where does Ukraine come into that? All right, because we have, I need to turn this off so that I can move this a little bit. Okay. So, if you've been paying attention to the news lately, you'll see that a lot of people are calling this Russian situation with Ukraine another kind of Cuban Missile Crisis. Other people are saying we have the early 1960s all over again. I think that if you look at the information that's in the news and in the conversations of the people around you, you will find that there are a lot of similarities to the 1960s. And okay, you could say, well, perhaps that's just the last time that we had conflict with Russia in the same way that we're having it now. And yes, that would be true. However, the thing is that it's oddly specific, the kind of conflict that we're having. So in order to talk about Russia on this map, we have to talk a little bit about the world island. And the world island is a modern term that I think Halford Mackinder came up with. The concept surely is very old. Geopolitics is an old art, but Halford Mackinder, the Brit, is credited with being the father of modern geopolitics. And his conceptions, coupled with those of Carl Schmitt, I think provide a very interesting framework for us to understand what is going on between NATO and Russia and Ukraine and the East and the West. So Mackinder's basic idea was that the world should be thought of in terms of the world island, which contains the heartland, and the heartland which is surrounded by rimland areas. And then beyond the rimlands, you have what are called the ring of exterior continents and islands, or the outer islands is what some people call them. I think this is what he calls it in the book. But any term that means outer islands, you can use. So the geopolitical chessboard that we're all dealing with here is heartland, rimland, and these are the world island. And then you have the outer islands. And the outer islands are the Americas, Africa, Australia, Indonesia, and some people say Japan, and maybe even a couple other islands. So, all right, this is the map. Now, in these places, the heartland, the rimland, the outer islands, there exist peoples with histories attached to certain geographies. And these people, with their histories, are shaped very profoundly and in ways that we probably could not even point to by their geography. And so the people who live in the heartland are known in these conceptual frameworks as the civilization of land. And the civilization of land is primarily headed by Russia. The civilization of the sea is primarily headed by the United States right now. And perhaps for the foreseeable future, it will be. Europe is a peninsula hanging off of the world island and into the ocean. Okay, so the current situation between Russia and Ukraine and NATO is one where the civilization of the sea, as defined by the Atlantic powers, which are NATO, is encroaching on the civilization of land. So the civilization of the sea is encroaching on the civilization of the land. And how do we know that? Well, the civilization of the sea is mostly these historically, let me get rid of this, is mostly these powers here that are hanging off into the water. Okay? And then this power here, which is a child of these ones, and this power here, well, this collection of powers, which is another child of these peninsular powers. So you have the civilization of the sea as expressed by the Atlantic powers and NATO. And what they're doing currently, and what they have been doing, is they've been trying to move toward the heartland for years by absorbing certain border countries that really do belong in history and perhaps in blood to the heartland civilization, which is composed of many peoples, but they're all very closely related. And so Ukraine is an instance of NATO, which is sea civilization, trying to take and occupy territory which really belongs by history and blood to the heartland civilization, which is Russia. So what this conflict is primarily is not a bully trying to go for funsies and take over another country just because he's bored. It's about the civilization of land, the heartland civilization, asserting its polar place in the world as a place of influence over its domain. And it's rejecting the endless appetite, it seems, of the civilization of the sea and the unipolar ideas, the global ideas that the civilization of the sea represents. One aside here that I'll point out is I think in looking at the world in this way, that it's almost as if it was metaphysically or geographically ordained that all these places here, perhaps even here, would be linked as peoples. So the people here would mix with the people here, and they would get the people here and the people here. Because that's literally what happened. That this mix is these areas and here. And perhaps it is because these are just the outer islands. I mean, we know it is because these are the outer islands. But it's interesting, why hasn't this happened, these kinds of mixtures? Why have these mixtures not happened everywhere else with culture and peoples? Maybe it has something to do with the geography. I mean, I think it does. It's a very simple explanation. So the current conflict is really a conflict of land and sea. Now, one of the things that Schmidt said in his book Land and Sea, which you should read, is he defined the Catholic religion and its expression in the Catholic Church as land civilization. And in land civilization, you see the archetype of the priest, you see a strong sense of tradition, and you see a strong idea of a central temple. It has a very stable and longevitous idea. This is what land civilization is about. Now, the Protestant sea civilization, as Schmidt sees it, is one without authority. There is no central authority for the states that make up the sea civilization. They improvise their existences, and they're, instead of being people of the temple, this central place, they're more wanderers. They're more desert people. So another thing that you'll see if you're looking at our map here is that people have been talking about the Westphalian system being called into question. And that's a very interesting statement, because the Westphalian system, the Peace of Westphalia, was 1648. That's when that was agreed to. And it was agreed to as a peace between land powers and sea powers. Land powers as defined by the Catholics, sea powers as defined by the Protestants. Now, the Peace of Westphalia had a precursor, which was the Peace of Augsburg. And we'll read about that now. So the Peace of Augsburg, this is Wikipedia, also called the Augsburg Settlement, was a treaties between Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Schmalkaldic League, signed in September 1555 at the imperial city of Augsburg. It officially ended the religious struggle between the two groups and made the legal division of Christianity permanent within the Holy Roman Empire, allowing rulers to choose either Lutheranism or Roman Catholicism as the official confession of their state. However, the Peace of Augsburg arrangement is also credited with ending much Christian unity around Europe. Calvinism was not allowed until the Peace of Westphalia. So, what I think is interesting here is that the Peace of the Peace of Augsburg, is fundamentally about land civilization, about tradition, about authority, versus sea civilization, about improvisation, about a lack of authority. And this situation has a corollary, because we see that down here, let's say we have 1555 is going to be probably in the middle, right? Well, down here, we also have about, 1919, which is the Treaty of Versailles. And you can look into that. I think that these two treaties are intersecularly parallel. They deal with similar characters, of course, because it's Europe, but it's similar circumstances that are at play here. Okay? Now, later on, 1649, which I guess is about right here, you have the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia is about establishing the nation state and allowing the different nation states to decide what route they're going to take. Are they going to be essentially land power? Are they going to decide to confess a Catholic confession? Or are they going to choose one of a variety of Protestant confessions? And so if you map these ideas out to where we are now, you find that our current situation is one where we're considering what should be done with nations who want to be either a part of the civilization of land or a part of the civilization of the sea. But you also see perhaps a departure from the Westphalian system, because it seems that Putin does not believe in the idea of the nation state. It seems that he believes in the idea that the nation state, as defined by a piece of paper, as defined by legal writ, is not legit unless it can be backed up by force. What really counts is a civilizational center. That's what it seems counts to him. And what that will do is it'll call into question the Westphalian system. And what I think is that we will have an agreement where nations become free to decide how they're going to be a part of the civilizations that they're a part of. It's no longer going to be assumed that everyone wants to be a democracy or a nation state. There are probably going to be civilizational centers, as Huntington talks about in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. And so I see some very interesting parallels with the Peace of Augsburg and the Treaties of Versailles and the Peace of Westphalia. And perhaps there's something to do with the fall of the Soviet Union over on this border here, where it's beginning to kick into action in the mid-'80s, and then it's just done by the time you get to 1989. But okay, so we have a conflict between a land power and a sea power, or a collection of sea powers. We have a conflict between land civilization and sea civilization. But I want to get a little bit into some specifics, and maybe even a little bit of what Carl Jung calls enantiodromia, which is where something goes so far into its identity that it becomes its opposite. In 1962 and thereabouts, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the land power trying to occupy the space of the sea civilization, the sea power. So Russia was trying to place missiles and influence in Cuba in order to have leverage against the leading sea power, the other pole in the bipolar world. Now, where we're at now has it so that we have been moving influence to the borders of Russia now. And we've been doing it for a while. And the latest instance of this is the past 8 or 9 years, where we've been encroaching on Ukraine as the sea power. And so this is kind of a flip, because you have actually the same type of situation that was going on over here, except that the characters are flipped, in that the land civilization was coming to the sea civilization space over here, and now over here the sea civilization is trying to encroach on the land civilization space in what many people are calling a new type of Cuban Missile Crisis. My opinion, based on the meta-saeculum and certain other patterns, is that the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine conflict will be that Ukraine is perhaps absorbed into Russia, or, and maybe a new agreement is reached with NATO, with the sea powers, in which they tell the Russians that they will no longer be trying to take states and areas that are geographically heartland, land civilization spaces, that the sea powers will no longer be trying to move into those areas. They will no longer also penalize those areas for not being a part of the sea civilization and its influence, cultural, political, religious, and otherwise, economic. So that's what I think is probably going to happen. But I do think that it's quite interesting that it's happening in line with all of the other things that we see happening here, where you have the summer season being a fractal map for the summer saeculum. And then you have especially the introduction, so that is the first quarter of this summer season, being a map even from the very start. And I think it's going to continue up until about 2040 for this huge area here. And this is also why I don't necessarily think we're going to have a Taiwan conflict right away. I think a lot of people are taking this opportunity to talk about China and Taiwan. I think perhaps if there is a China-Taiwan situation, it'll probably happen over here. Because when we were here in the summer season, in this third quarter, well, the Chinese were helping the Viet Cong in Vietnam. And it was kind of a proxy war with China. And I think that if there's going to be a conflict with the Chinese, between the West and the Chinese, and if this map is consistent, which it seems to be, it'll probably occur sometime between 2060 and 2080. That's just my prediction. So that's a brief explanation of fractal foreshadowing. What you can do with it is you can take it and apply it anywhere on the meta-saeculum and find the corresponding place. As I said, the small summer is going to map to the large summer. The small autumn is going to map to the large autumn. The small winter is going to map to the large winter. And then the small spring will map to the large spring. So before I sign off, I would like to thank my new subscribers to the channel and also on Gumroad, and the people who have purchased the maps on themapmaker.gumroad.com. Thank you very much for supporting the channel, for having an interest in cyclical time, and for exploring all the possibilities that cyclical time affords us. There was a question that someone asked on the channel. Ty says, "This is fascinating. Please keep up the content." Thank you, Ty. I plan to. So when we are at the last saeculum of a meta-saeculum, are there historical themes you've noticed that marked the end of the meta? I know they are all winter saeculums, so the idea to start with winter themes, then narrow down to themes that overlap with cross-saecular event themes. So I'll stop right there for a second. What it seems like you're asking is, how did we orient the map? And I talk a little bit about this in episode 1 but we oriented it by finding what were the most total wars. It was mostly wars, and then after that, it was awakenings. So we were looking here, what are the most total wars that we can find in the map? And it seems that the most total wars are the Armada Crisis, World War II, the World War I, and the wars that led to the Peace of Augsburg, all this intolerance and martyrdom in the aftermath of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. These are really, really total wars. Now, the wars over here, for example, the American Revolution in the United States, are less total, and they're more filled with hope, though they do have a kind of disintegration nature. They're heading into a period of individualism. Okay, so the cross-secular event themes, let's see if I can get back to that. The cross-secular event themes are probably... So the cross-secular event themes are definitely at play here, because you can see how the Third Great Awakening or the Protestant Reformation, these are different and more total, more kind of frozen than the Great Awakening. And one of the things that you would expect about an awakening in an awakening saeculum is it would be the most awakeningest awakening that you can have. So it's Summer of Summer, the awakeningest awakenings. We have this written down here. And surely that ends up what they agree to call this moment. They call it the Great Awakening. And this has to do, as a little aside, with narrative as a socially symbolic act. I've read reviews about this book. I'm familiar with some of its ideas. I'm really looking forward to reading it. In fact, I used some of the money that my subscribers have paid for the meta-saeculum maps and the broadcast in order to buy this. And I'm looking forward to reading it. I'll probably do a review and share with everyone how we are applying these ideas and others in order to understand the meta-saeculum. So let's get back to the rest of the question. All right. Also, do the meta themes of the cross-secular inconclusive have any standalone consideration outside of the inherent role in the cross-secular major event? For example, the U.S. Civil War. Well, I think if I'm understanding this part of the question correctly, that there are some very interesting standalone themes here. And these kind of get into what can properly be called secular logoi, which is the DNA of the whole shell. So it'll be the mythological character or ideal that everyone in the entire shell, whether they know it or not, is contrasting their narrative lives against and all of their decisions. So that ideal character, which is at the very center of the civilization, which will either be one or one of two characters, maybe more, but I think it seems to be pretty consistently a kind of two brothers thing. There's usually a founding murder at the very beginning, it seems, and then also at the edges. You have this recapitulation of people having to embrace the ideal that is the logos of the civilization in order to be reborn into the new saeculum. So it seems that is a principle that makes each one of these slices also have other things that are unique to each slice occur in them that are not necessarily related just to the agrarian metaphors. For example, the Bernoulli principle, which has to do with a discovery about interacting with fluids, I'm being very broad and general here, comes down here with the invention of the airplane. Let's say, I think it's about right here. And it turns out that in this same area, the Dutch, so we have here and about right here, the Dutch invented a sail that allowed them to, in a sense, fly across the wind rather than sailing with the wind. And that's an invention that happened here. And then we moderns figure out how to sail across the wind and generate lift in a vertical fashion rather than just a horizontal fashion across the water. We do it into the air. And those two things happened in the same area on the meta. Now, it seems to me that other places on the map have their unique fractal characteristics. You have Gutenberg down here across from the internet up here, and personal computers. So you have personal printing press down here. Basically, anyone can make a printing press. It's very democratized. And then you have that same kind of idea up here. Now, these are not just disintegration things, though they do kind of disintegrate things, right? They distribute in a democratic fashion a certain kind of technology. But it's also a very specific kind of technology that is occurring in this slice, right? So it seems that different slices have certain kinds of things that will show up in them. And maybe this situation down here with gaining power over fluids and over air has something to do with, let's say, if Jesus is at the center of our civilization, it may have to do with his stories of having power over the elements. So if you have a huge emphasis on power over the elements that exists in the ideal, which is the core pattern of your civilization, it's probably going to be expressed fractally as you move around the civilization, and then different slices will be related to that individual characteristic. So, this is just my speculation here. However, I find that René Girard has some very good things on founding myths and founding murders. You should check him out. Freud as well, and many others. So look into these things. I think that about covers it for today. If you'd like to support the broadcast, the Conch Republic, you can like and subscribe, like this video, subscribe, and also consider buying a high-resolution map on Gumroad and becoming a paying subscriber. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.